salads and soups, open Monday through Saturday. Online ordering and menu at clarastidbits.com. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Anne Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, a proposal to change state debt collection rules forces local advocates into action. Then we preview WJCT's new podcast, Kingpins and Catalysts, with our new director of podcasting. And we'll tell you all about St. Practice Day, a first-of-its-kind event staged by multiple Mayport breweries. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org or tag us on social media. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. The Labor Department says consumer prices rose 0.2% in February over what they were the previous month. It's less than what some economists expected. The inflation news comes as President Trump's 25% tariffs on all foreign imports of aluminum and steel took effect overnight. NPR's Lauren Frayer reports from London, Britain will not take countermeasures.
Unlike the European Union, Britain has decided to take Trump's tariffs on the chin and not retaliate. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer held what both sides described as warm talks with Trump last month at the White House, where they said they're negotiating a trade deal that would make tariffs moot. But that has not materialized yet. British officials had nevertheless been hoping for a U-turn from Trump, or an exemption for the UK from these tariffs on steel and aluminum, which the head of UK steel and industry body says will hit the United Kingdom hard. Lauren Frayer, NPR News, London.
The House of Representatives has passed a Republican-backed government spending bill and sent it on to the Senate. Senate Republicans are urging Democrats to support the measure and avert a partial federal government shutdown that could happen late Friday night. NPR's Claudia Grisales says congressional Democrats don't like it.
It extends a current stopgap spending plan through September at lower 2024 levels. This in particular was key to keeping hardline members on board for these forced cuts that we would see in some cases. It's a feature of these kinds of stopgap bills, also known as continuing resolutions, to keep spending flat. But it's also a rarity to see Congress to fund the government this way for an entire year.
NPR's Claudia Grisales reporting. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says he expects to have contact with Russian officials today. This follows his conversations yesterday with Ukrainian officials about ending Russia's war. Rubio says Ukraine agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. NPR's Eleanor Beardsley reports Ukrainians are relieved that the United States has resumed sharing intelligence and sending U.S. military aid.
The Trump administration says it never stopped the flow of intelligence needed for the defense of Ukrainian civilians. Nevertheless, 35-year-old Kyiv resident Dima Suhak says he's relieved the information is flowing again.
I think that's great. We need this information for sure.
And how did you feel when it was stopped?
I feel disgusted.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky hailed the ceasefire deal, saying he wanted to thank President Trump for the constructive conversation between our teams. It's a complete turnaround from the Oval Office blow-up between Zelensky and Trump nearly 2 weeks ago. All eyes are now on Russia. Eleanor Beardsley, NPR News, Kyiv.
On Wall Street and pre-market trading, Dow futures are up more than 200 points. You're listening to NPR News.
The time is now 4 minutes after 9. This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. I'm Michelle Coram. A lengthy investigation triggered by the November seizure of dozens of pets from one Middleburg home results in yesterday's arrest of a Clay County couple. WJCT News 89.9's Dan Scanlon reports.
Antonio DeLua, 26, and 24-year-old wife Jocelyn DeLua were arrested and booked into the Clay County Jail after a judge signed off on 78 total animal cruelty charges between them, the sheriff's office says. A joint investigation by Jacksonville and Clay County Sheriff's offices kicked off in late November after the couple brought 2 dead dogs into a veterinarian's office in Clay County to be cremated and gave no information as to how they died. Staff saw the dead animals were in bad shape and passed on their concerns about suspicion of animal cruelty to the authorities, according to news partner News4Jax. That resulted in animal cruelty investigations by Jacksonville and Clay County officials and a November 27th search of the couple's home on Ashton Street in Middleburg with Clay County Animal Services, according to police. That is where dozens of animals were rescued after being kept in deplorable conditions, police say. Dan Scanlon, WJCT News, 89.9.
The husband and wife each face dozens of animal cruelty charges. Bail was set at $100,000 each. The temperature in Jacksonville is 50 degrees. We'll get to almost 80 this afternoon. A sunny day with some gusty south wind. Tonight, a low of 50, near 75 for Thursday afternoon. Mostly sunny tomorrow.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Doris Duke Foundation, which aims to support the well-being of people and the planet for a more creative, equitable, and sustainable future. And listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Anne Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, a seemingly obscure change to an already obscure law could dramatically cut legal aid for Florida's poorest residents. We talked to an advocate about what locals and lawmakers need to know. Later in the program, a new WJCT podcast featuring deep dive interviews with area kingpins and catalysts will tell you how you can get early access. But first, it can be hard to track the fast and furious pace of bills during Florida's legislative session. Here to slow down one proposal that could cost local communities millions is Jim Kowalski, President and Chief Executive Officer at Jacksonville Area Legal Aid. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So, Jim, there have been a couple of bills that Legal Aid is following in the legislature. And let's start with one that's being heard at a meeting this morning at the Senate Judiciary Committee. We can get into the details of Senate Bill 498 and how it would work. But let's sort of start at the end instead of the beginning. What would be the financial impact on Florida's legal aid community if this bill passed?
So the funding for statewide legal aid has increased dramatically because of a change the Supreme Court made to a rule that regulates lawyers. And what's happening now in Tallahassee, as you mentioned, the first hearing is today in the Senate, would then cut that increase by about 2/3 statewide. So we had a significant increase, and now we're facing an enormous decrease.
For people who aren't familiar, what is legal aid, the recipient of this funding?
So lawyers have to have trust accounts, right? We have trust accounts and operating accounts, and the trust accounts are client money. So think of a lawyer that does real estate closings. When you close on a house, that money goes into that lawyer's trust account and then gets dispersed to the seller, to the closing agent, to the broker, to somebody who does an appraisal. For the few seconds or minutes or days or months that money is sitting in a trust account, it's earning little pieces of interest. And Florida was the first state in the country to say those little pieces of interest, because we can't figure out mathematically which client or how much of a client they should go to, we're going to send them to a central agency, and that will support legal services for the poor. It's called IOTA, or interest on trust accounts. And that's the funding we're talking about. It's controlled by the Supreme Court. The bar looks at it, and there's an entity called the Florida Bar Foundation, now known as Funding Florida Legal Aid, that actually receives that money from those banks that work with lawyers and then sends it out to legal aid all over the state.
And legal aid uses it to do what? Like, what is the mission of legal aid around the state?
So we represent low-income and at-risk individuals in civil court. The easy example would be a senior in a reverse mortgage foreclosure. We know that banks make mistakes. There are many seniors who are facing reverse mortgage foreclosures that are solvable. We can keep that senior in the home, but private lawyers don't represent seniors in reverse mortgage foreclosure cases because there's no money in it. That's a typical role for civil legal aid. Another typical role would be eviction. There are evictions that are wrongful. We work with the city, for example. The city of Jacksonville has an eviction diversion program that we developed with the court system, with Jewish families, and with United Way that helps keep people housed where we know that not being housed, being homeless, is much more expensive for a society than keeping somebody housed. So those are two easy traditional roles for civil legal aid that we would use IOTA money to support.
So we know that under the law, if somebody's charged with a crime and they can't afford an attorney on the criminal side, they'll be provided one by the court. There is no such provision when it comes to civil matters. And that is sort of what legal aid serves, is helping those people. But it doesn't have a dedicated funding source in the state budget, unlike most other states.
Yeah, unlike 48 other states. But that's a really great analogy. It's similar to the right to a lawyer in criminal court. You have no right to counsel in civil court. That is the traditional role civil legal aid plays. And in 48 other states, like Texas, those states dedicate sometimes tens and hundreds of millions of dollars of state money. Florida and Iowa are the two states in the nation that dedicate zero general state support for civil legal aid, which is why we've always been so reliant on IOTA. It's a non-taxpayer source. It's supervised and controlled by the Supreme Court that has the job of regulating lawyers under the state constitution, and it flows to civil legal aid law firms all across the state like JALA.
So this proposal, as you say, would cut funding statewide by approximately 2/3. It would cut that IOTA trust fund money that goes to legal aid around the state. Why is that being proposed? Who is proposing this measure?
So what we know now is while the 170 banks are participating and working with local law firms, we have 2 IOTA accounts ourselves with Regions. While 170 banks are participating, there are a few banks, mainly on the West Coast, that don't appreciate that this money isn't going back to them, right? If it doesn't go to the Florida Bar Foundation, it's simply profit for the banks. And so when the Supreme Court tweaked the interest rate rule that we have to follow as lawyers, we have to work with banks that will follow the Supreme Court rule that applies to us. A small number of banks, a very small minority of banks, are now going to the legislature saying, hey, we need you to put your thumb back on the scale for us. We'd rather keep that money. We think it's too much to give to Florida civil legal aid.
The rule change a couple of years ago basically said, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, but basically said that lawyers who are creating these trust funds have to make sure that they're working with banks that offer basically the best possible rate of return on those trust funds, so that the IOTA account must be able to get at least as much interest on their trust fund account as, say, any other kind of similar trust fund account that the bank offers. Is that correct?
That's exactly what the rule said, and it has said for many, many years. But what happened once interest rates started going back up, right? Once the Fed increased interest rates, obviously during the recession they went to zero. But once the Fed increased those interest rates, the disparity between the banks that were paying the rule rate voluntarily and those that weren't became much more clear. And the Supreme Court then said, okay, we've told you, lawyers, you need to work with banks that pay the highest comparable rate. There's a group here that aren't. So we're going to tell you what the highest comparable rate is, and we're going to say you have to work with banks that will comply with what we say to you as lawyers. And that's when the income jumped, and that's when we all realized, oh, wait, these banks were simply pocketing this money as opposed to remitting it to the Florida Bar Foundation for Civil Legal Aid.
And I think, to be fair, these banks that have brought this amendment proposal would say, look, you're asking for this enormous, almost overnight increase in what we had been providing as interest. It's unreasonable. We should at least have time to phase it in, as opposed to just all of a sudden having to shell out this enormous amount of money.
Agreed, and I would agree with that. Typically, we don't want too much of a disruption to any single sector of business. But the fact is there are 170 banks that are now compliant, that were compliant early and have said, yeah, we can take this change to our business model, and we still want to play in this space because we still think it's profitable for us. We still think it's profitable to work with lawyers and then send this interest to the Florida Bar Foundation. There's a small minority who've said, no, we'd really like to keep that money as opposed to sending it. We'd like to keep it as profits for ourselves.
So that money that legal aid receives statewide, some of that increase that resulted from the increase in insurance rates went to a reserve fund. And I think that that's also part of the question as to whether legal aid should be putting money into reserves when it has this money. And perhaps the banking folks that oppose that are saying, look, some of that money is obviously unnecessary. It's going into this reserve account.
Right. So two things. Number one, we being Civil Legal Aid, didn't ask the Supreme Court to set up reserves. We didn't say this is a good idea. We said we can overwhelmingly spend this and deploy it on the street. But the Supreme Court gets to regulate us, and objectively, reserves businesses having a reserve in a time of high return is objectively a good idea. So even though we said we could spend it, we're certainly not objecting to the Supreme Court disagreeing with us and deciding that reserves are a better idea. And we know from very recent past that the Florida Bar Foundation, having had reserves at the beginning of the recession, helped them support civil legal aid for years after interest rates went to zero. So as any business, you want to kind of zero out the waves, and reserves are a way to do that. But our main pushback to that point is, hey, it's not a windfall. We could have deployed it, but we also want to make sure that we have the funds to deploy in the future.
So talk about how you could use that money. I mean, Jacksonville Area Legal Aid serves, I think, a 17-county area in North and North Central Florida. You have thousands of clients, but what is your estimate of how, if you were able to use even a portion of that reserve, how that would be spent?
Well, so just look at what we've done with the increase that we just received and that we received last year. We've added a lawyer in St. Johns County. For the very first time, with some help from the Nassau County Commission and the Center for Aging in Nassau County, we now have a full-time Nassau County attorney. We're adding lawyers in our pro bono unit so we can better serve some of our rural counties. And then some of the things that have been decreased, right? We've all seen entities that serve domestic violence victims get federal funding from a trust fund called the VOCA Fund. This is domestic violence shelters, domestic violence legal aid lawyers, those types of entities. That has been cut. So this is a chance to keep that work for our most vulnerable citizens going using IOTA instead of VOCA, for example. All of that we've already done, and we will continue to do in the future as long as this funding stream stays secure and the current effort is pushed back.
So we know that if there is not a legal aid attorney available, it doesn't mean the case goes away. So what do we know about cases that proceed where the person that's involved in the civil litigation is representing themselves?
So we know generally they're far slower. We know the success rate in cases such as eviction and debt collection. Wrongful debt collection is another area we focus on. We know from statistics that the failure rate of those individuals not being able to explain their positions to a court is overwhelmingly high. And we know when somebody is represented, those losses are substantially cut, particularly in those two areas where the self-represented numbers are still so high.
Because they can really create a backlog.
It slows things down for the courts. It means that businesses that want to have a dispute in court can't get their day in court because the judges are working with an overflow of pro se unrepresented litigants. It messes up the whole system.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to Jacksonville Area Legal Aid CEO Jim Kowalski about legislation the group is watching in Tallahassee. You can join the conversation by giving us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. I want to ask you about a different measure that you were watching that you were successful last week in defeating. Tell us a little bit about this. Was a very small change to a Consumer Collection Practices Act, basically language that protects consumers during debt collection.
So Florida has a strong act that applies to efforts to collect a debt. It is called the Florida Consumer Collection Practices Act. People may have heard of the federal counterpart, which is called the FDCPA, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act on the federal level. The Florida Act was broader, and it applied to landlords, it applies to HOAs and COAs, it applies to car dealers. And what it does is it prevents people from using really abusive practices in the collection of a debt. We use it all the time, our consumer team, and private practice consumer protection lawyers use it all the time. And so, as you mentioned, last week, a number of us went to Tallahassee because we had learned of a very late 2-word tweak that would have ended the statute. And it was very interesting to participate in that process, to engage in that direct democracy, to speak to our senators, and we were successful. We defeated the amendment that would have changed those 2 words in its very first hearing before the Florida Senate. So it was very interesting and exciting to watch and be a part of.
And so this change basically would have modified the language. Instead of saying that any person was prohibited from these certain practices, to saying any debt collectors were prohibited from these practices. So explain to us, first of all, what the practices are specifically that the language of the law prohibits, and why changing it from any person to any debt collector would make a difference.
So let me give you an example. This is what I said during my testimony. I just flipped the statute. If it had passed, the amendment had passed, and those 2 words were taken out. So in collecting a consumer debts, a door-to-door scammer would have been able to pretend to be a police officer or use or threaten force or violence. A landlord would have been able to threaten to call a tenant's employer in order to collect without ever going to court or even confirming the amount was correct, or harass or abuse the tenant, or use profane, obscene, vulgar, or willfully abusive language in communicating with the tenant and any member of his or her family. An HOA or a COA would have been able to threaten to enforce a debt they know is not legitimate, or use fake government communications and pretend to be a government employee. All of those are quotes from the statute. We just flipped it to say, if you take out these 2 words, all of those things are now possible in Florida, whereas yesterday they would have been prohibited.
So these are things that a contractor could come to your door, pretend to be law enforcement to try to collect a debt, could talk to your neighbors about your debt, could call your employer.
Right, and we see those things anyway. That was part of what we were trying to share. We had actual examples of cases we had filed and other consumer protection lawyers had filed using the FCCPA. The bad actors are already violating it. Imagine if it was legal to violate it and we didn't have that statute. But one of the easy examples, like you picked up on, was what happens after a storm in the First Coast. We have door-to-door contractors that come up and they say, hey, we noticed there's a shingle missing. We'll get your entire roof repaired. We'll bill your insurance company, or there's a government program, or we'll put solar up and JEA will now pay you, or you'll get a cut on your taxes. 0 of which are true. But if the homeowner then doesn't pay, they use these abusive tactics They apply liens to the homes, and in many cases, our cases involve attempts to foreclose those liens and actually take the homes. So another traditional role for civil legal aid. In this case, private consumer protection lawyers also do that as well.
And we know that seniors can be particularly vulnerable to these tactics. What is the situation when it comes to seniors' exposure to fraud and attempted scams?
It is enormous, and it is increasing. So part of what we try to do with our education, part of what we do with the other agencies locally that serve seniors and work with seniors is try to get the word out. When something like this is happening, to your mom or dad, you notice contract work at their house when you come over to visit, ask those questions. There's something that's happening. Typically, they're using some sort of a digital signature. Somebody's signing on an iPhone or an iPad. What they're actually agreeing to is an entire contract that's sitting behind that screen that is supposed to be delivered to them immediately by email. And we know in some of these cases, the email addresses are just made up, or the senior may not use email to communicate and never get that copy of the contract and even know what they've agreed to. So we're very watchful for these types of scams affecting our seniors, particularly in Florida.
So you said that this amendment would have affected kind of state protections. There are some federal protections, but these specific ones that you're talking about, the sort of landlord fraud, the contractor, that stuff needs this state language to protect these people. So who's on the other side? Who's proposing changing this language?
So we don't know, right? The initial bill had a little tweak to how you can communicate somebody that you already have a business relationship with. And we didn't object to the original draft of the statute, making this little correction. We thought it was an okay idea. It didn't affect our cases. But then very late in the process, the hearing was last Wednesday in front of the Senate Commerce and Tourism Committee. Very late in the process, I think Thursday, Wednesday, the week before, less than a week notice, we learned of this attempt to change those two words that you've talked about. And we kind of panicked and responded.
So you learned about it, but it's not clear, I mean, from the lawmaker that introduced it, where this language came from or who was proposing it?
No, and we still don't know. We know that the debt collection industry tries this with this particular statute. The last time, I think, was about 9 years ago. So it is something we try to have our radar up for, our spidey sense up for, but this was very late in the game. But again, the process worked, right? We reached out to the senators. We spent the morning meeting with staff. The hearing was in the afternoon. A couple of us testified, and it was unanimously defeated. So it was as much these days as it may be hard to engage in direct democracy and reach out to your elected officials. And I'm as guilty of sometimes being jaded about that as anybody. It worked. We were successful. It was great to get the win, and we saved this huge consumer protection statute for the state.
Just a couple of messages. One from Michael emailing, pound for pound, Jacksonville Area Legal Aid attorneys are the best in Northeast Florida. The plan to reduce their income is another example of the malign MAGA influence. Also a message on Instagram saying, always a pleasure to have Jacksonville Area Legal Aid on the air. I want to ask you about that participatory effort that you all made and your success in defeating that particular amendment. This is a very shortened runway that we have this legislative season. Can you kind of explain why that is and why that presents some additional challenges for lawmakers and citizens?
Sure. So this is something we actually heard about during the effort to defeat the amendment to 55972, the Florida Consumer Collection Practices Act. When there's a special session, the actual regular session is truncated. It's shrunk by however long the special session is. So what we found out was that many of the aides, for example, that we were meeting with and calling and texting and sending letters to, hadn't had time to figure out what this bill was about or the substantial change it would affect on Florida. And so it made it more important to be there and try to show the change. And the same for this next bill, Senate Bill 498 on changing IOTA. The legislators in our state, running the third largest state in the country, have a very short amount of time to work through their actual session, and even less time now because of the special sessions.
Because even though the timing of this regular session didn't change, the weeks before a regular session begins, if there isn't a special session, is often spent with these kinds of meetings where people are familiarizing themselves with the content of the legislation that's being proposed.
And it's quieter, right? You can go there and have some longer discussions. You can sit in a conference room over coffee and really kind of work out the causes and effects of a particular piece of legislation. Here, though, we're going in on a Wednesday morning and the hearing's Wednesday afternoon, and we've spent the last 48 hours, and that's it, right? So that's what made it all the more startling that the amendment was unanimously defeated during the hearing. We won't have to go back throughout the rest of the legislative session, even though we're obviously watching this bill as it tracks through the House and Senate. And so far, no attempt has been made to amend it to remove those two words.
So that's a win, but in terms of other legislation, are you anticipating anything else might crop up?
I think all the bills that have been filed or can be filed have been filed. So right now, the two big ones that are affecting civil legal aid and our clients most particularly are the shift to the IOTA rule, as you've talked about, and this other amendment that we defeated but are still watching.
Well, it is amazing how the minutia of legislation can have such consequential impacts. But Jim Kowalski, thanks so much for flagging that for us and for the work that you do with Jacksonville Area Legal Aid.
Again, thank you so much for having us this morning.
All right. Up next, WJCT rolls out a new curated collection of on-demand audio, including exclusive podcasts. We'll tell you where you can tune in and sign up right after the break. Welcome back. Well, today we have one of our own in the studio, Letitia Barriola, WJCT's Director of Podcasting. She's here to talk about two exciting projects we recently worked on together and how they connect to our current membership drive, as well as what's new in WJCT's growing podcast network. Letitia, good morning.
Hey, Anne. So happy to be here. How are you?
This is not your first go around this morning. I know you've been on air with David Luckin talking about the pledge drive, but you are, of course, a former TV news anchor here in Jacksonville. We actually worked in the business at the same time, although we worked at different stations. But now you're just down the hall.
I am. And, I have to say, it was such a highlight when I knew I was coming here because I knew you were here. So I was like, oh, Anne Schindler's there. Great.
Well, I was equally excited to hear that you were coming. And so you're now helping to introduce our listeners to on-demand audio. Tell us what you've been building with this WJCT News Now project.
Yes. So we look at this as a bridge. Our radio listeners, they're faithful. They're tuning in their cars. They may be streaming. But we want to introduce sort of this audience to on-demand listening. But in short, it's podcasting, a way to listen to content, original content from WJCT, from NPR, on the go, whenever you want. That's why we say on demand. And so this bridge that we created is called WJCT News Now. And we're making this sort of a member benefit. When you come on board to become what we call a sustainer, someone who gives monthly at a certain amount, you sort of unlock some bonus podcast content from right here from people like you and Stephen Ponson and Dr. Joe, but also with NPR. I mean, they're offering ad-free bonus content from NPR, and we're sort of bundling this together as a thank you when you come on board to support us.
And that's something that is available to people who become new sustainers and members. But for our existing ones,
Absolutely.
This is something that they can access already.
Yes. So if you are already giving at $11.90 and above, you sort of qualify for this member benefit. And we want you to indulge and experience it because you've already unlocked that access. So we're looking at this as sort of a way to incentivize being a member and keeping independent local journalism alive and supporting all that we do at WJCT News, but also opening the door for you to experience podcast listening.
Yeah. So this is early access. You know, there's a number of things that are offered, but one of the things that is included is this podcast that you and I have worked on together for a few months now called Kingpins and Catalysts. It's this deep dive storytelling series. We're talking to people with extraordinary connections to Jacksonville. And it started as kind of a small project, but it has morphed, some might say metastasized, but it has turned into a big podcast undertaking.
Yes. I mean, podcast production in general is hard work. I mean, it's a full-on production of organizing interviews, doing the interviews, writing the show notes, uploading it. So we sort of started on this adventure, and I came to you like, so who would you want to talk to, right? We started with, who are you inspired by? And you sort of started making some calls and lining up interviews, and it has evolved to, well, let's give early access to our members, people who sign up to become sustainers. Let's give them a first listen, and then it will be public in April 1st, so everyone can enjoy it. But I'm really excited about this because it was a chance for us to collaborate and think creatively and give you more time, right? First Coast Connect is very structured with your interviews. This is sort of a long form way to get to know some of the people that you are inspired by.
Yeah. And while, you know, it was a lot of work, the easy and certainly the very fun part was having these conversations with these really cool people. And I want to, if we can, play some of the clips so that people get a sense of the folks that we're talking to. One episode in particular that we both like a great deal is this interview that I did with Willie Evans Jr., which when I started talking to you about him and playing his music, you immediately were like,
yes,
I know this.
Oh, yeah. And you had this whole backstory that I had never really heard about sort of this group. And so it became this story that we had to tell, and we had to give it its due justice and time. So it's actually our first episode that kicks off the whole season.
Yeah. And Willie Evans Jr. is still making music. He's a really well-known hip hop artist on the First Coast. But his band that was really successful, Asimov, kind of hit the ground running and then hit a really big snag. And he talks in this episode about the lessons learned from that experience. Let's just take a little listen to what he had to say.
It's important to pay attention to the perspectives around you, because I think our perspective collectively was that we're kind of like a happy to be here type of thing. And if you're not paying attention, people can see that from like miles away. And so they know if you're happy to be here, you don't care about handling your business correctly. You don't care about getting paid. You know what I mean? You don't care about any of that because you love this thing so much. You're just happy to be doing it. And more than 10 people said that it's good.
Yeah, so that's just a short portion of the interview. He also experienced some really difficult periods, and he talks about that too.
Yeah, he had some profound losses. I mean, 2 of the 4 members of the original Asimov have died, both very, very close friends of his. And those losses have informed his music and his art since then. He's written a number of pieces in tribute and kind of along with them, you know, in his spirit. So it's a really revealing, and I think, you know, interesting but moving interview with him.
Mm-hmm. You know, I just remembered, I don't know if we said the title of this podcast, and I think it's so telling when you hear the people we've talked to or you've talked to. Kingpins and Catalysts is the name that we landed on. And, you know, Willie is like a good example of a catalyst, that someone who was like getting all this momentum and moving music forward. And then like his story sort of was disrupted, and he talks about that. And we've got some kingpins too, which you spoke to Ann Finnell. That's a good segue into her. Legendary defense attorney Ann Finnell. That's also one of our interviews.
Yeah, she's extraordinary. I actually remember one time when she was having maybe her last court argument, seeing all of these prosecutors and defense attorneys kind of running out of the courtroom that I was in. And I was like, what's going on? What's happening? And they were like, oh, it's Ann's final argument. You know, she's and, nobody wants to miss it. Anyway, she has been on some incredible cases here. She defended Brenton Butler, who was a 16-year-old who was accused wrongfully of murder, and won that case in 2000. But the case also was like covered by a documentary crew. It won an Academy Award. So it is a legendary piece of Jacksonville history. But she also worked on the Casey Anthony trial, which is the woman who was accused of murdering her child and ultimately acquitted. Let's just take a listen to what she had to say about that case.
The media was crazy. I mean, they would follow you every minute you were outside the courtroom, walking backwards down the street. I actually had a guy trip over something and fall down on the ground trying to film us as we're walking down the street. And then you had a whole area that was cordoned off where they had the protesters yelling at you and screaming horrible things like, how can you represent Casey Anthony? I'd never seen anything like it. We had to pick a jury in Clearwater, but I didn't really have to go to court much after that. And then I got the call that there was a not guilty. I was never so relieved in my life. I mean, thank goodness for that, huh?
And again, we're playing these clips because, you know, this is your first podcast. It's being released early to people who sign up sort of today to become a member, a sustaining member. You get to unlock early access to this. And so, you know, that was a well-remembered Florida case, right? Casey Anthony, and she talks much more about her career. And speaking of Casey Anthony, we sort of looked at like what she's doing now. It's interesting. She's claiming to be sort of a legal advocate on Substack now. So she's still out there and
remains a very divisive figure.
For sure.
Yeah.
Another person we talked to, Anne, Dana Miller. You know,
this is interesting because Dana is, you know, I mean, we talk about kingpins and catalysts. He actually was a kingpin. I mean, he was a drug kingpin for a number of years. He was ultimately served a long stint in prison, and he's gone on to be a real force on the East Side. He is an inspirational character. He's a barber. He speaks to the community. And I first met him when we were doing a segment on First Coast Connect about trauma and insomnia and the experiences that he's had, which included, you know, many close people to him dying. He himself was shot many, many times. So it wasn't until later that I learned about his role in the crack era in Jacksonville and kind of his role in turning his life around. And he talks about that in the interview that we did.
When they kicked my door in, I was hiding off cocaine, and I had my daughter with me. And when they came in, they told me to put my hands up. I put my hands up. They found my stash of cocaine. They found a lot of money and guns. And when they said, Dana Miller, we have you, they told, put your hand behind your back. I put my hand behind my back. And do you believe I felt peace? I felt peace. It's like God has just taken me away. He was removing me out that lifestyle. And the peace that I wanted, it's just like it just came over me.
His story is so intense. I mean, he talks, as you hear a little bit about in that clip, you know, he's doing drugs. He has his daughter there. And then police come and his life really did change in that moment.
It did. And sort of the through line, if you will, through the clips that you're hearing, and you'll talk more about who else you interviewed, is that, you know, these are people who had an impact on the city, or their roots are in the city. And in turn, they impacted the city, or their stories are still being told and sort of recycled into the fabric of Jacksonville. So even in Dana's interview, he talks a lot about the East Side. You know what I mean? With Anne, you hear her talk about being, you know, downtown and working in the city. So you hear these sort of like cultural moments in Jacksonville that you may not have heard of. unless you listen to an in-depth conversation with some of these people that you've chosen.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the one thing that is unifying about this is we're talking to people who are kind of Jacksonville and from the First Coast, but have also had really intense and profound impacts on the narrative of the First Coast and the history of the First Coast. In some cases, I know that one of the favorite people that we talk to is a kind of hero of yours, Dr. Johnnetta Cole.
Can we tell them what happened when she was in the building? It was like a legend stepped foot in the building, and people started coming out and greeting her, and she was so gracious and kind and took pictures and gave us wise. I mean, she wanted to talk to my husband on FaceTime. Like, this is Dr. Cole, right? So even that interview, sitting here and listening to you talk to her about, her roots down or up at the beach, right? And her legacy there with her family, and then Spelman College. That's part of what you get when you tune in to Kingpins and Catalysts.
Yeah, and she is sort of everything, right? She's an anthropologist. She's an educator. She actually she's a director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art. So she is, truly a legend on the First Coast. But it's a really interesting look at, like as you say, her lineage, her inspiration, her connections to her sister, who is really well known here on the First Coast as Beach Lady.
Mm-hmm.
But we also talked to Jacksonville University basketball legend Artis Gilmore, who was a really fun interview. We talked to current council member Ken Amaro and Dr. Kimberly Allen of 90 Forward. So some of these people are well known, but they're all reflecting on some really deep and profound and sometimes really painful personal experiences that they had. I think in particular about Artis Gilmore's story about growing up in Chipley, Florida.
Yes. I mean, they're very candid about sort of their early days when Jacksonville was sort of very different. But I like how you've asked them to sort of reflect on the past, but also give their assessment of how the city's doing now, right? You ask them, so, have we changed for the better? Or what do you think of where we're at right now? And each person kind of gave a different answer. So it was really interesting to see how they responded to that.
So this is one of many things, as we said, on this new WJCT News Now offering. This is just one thing. There's a bunch of other things.
Yes.
Including a news element that is really fresh and essential every day.
Yeah. So when we thought about this, we thought, what do people go to podcasting the most for? And every time you see the top podcast, it's usually around news. People want to stay informed on their timetable. So we have a show in WJCT News Now, which is called The Morning Report. And our morning anchor is putting together an expanded newscast so that when you wake up or just on your time, right? We give you the news here on WJCT News 89.9, right?
At the top of the hour.
At the top of the hour, it's there. But if you want something on demand when you're on your walk, when you're on a break, when you're doing the dishes, we wanted to give you an on-the-go version of what we do on the radio. And so when you come and sign up to become a sustainer, meaning you're giving monthly at a certain amount, you get to unlock this on-demand morning newscast in your phone every day. 5 days a week.
And there is also a special offering from our own Dr. Joe. I mean, people already know him from What's Health Got to Do with It, but he does a special thing for the podcast. First Coast Connect does a special thing for the podcast.
Yes, for Dr. Joe. I really enjoy that. It's kind of a shameless plug. I get to interview Dr. Joe. And if you've ever met him or listened to him, he's a dynamic, brilliant guy. So we're breaking down the weekly health news, which we know there's a load of it coming at us. He's sort of simplifying, like this episode today is about the measles. It's about daylight savings time. It's about Pope Francis and his illness. So we're trying to stay relevant with what's happening in news, and Dr. Joe is breaking it down.
Yeah, and the First Coast Connect element is really just a way to highlight things that have been on this show in the morning that either, there's a little bit more information, a backstory to, or just kind of wanting to draw people's attention to it in case they missed it.
Yes, and I think this show in particular may evolve even more, Anne. You're already doing a lot, right? You're on the air every day.
Yeah, I'm going to caution you when you're saying that. Exactly what more am I going to be doing?
No, not more, but it's your time to sit back and think, like, what's an interview I really want people to take a second look at, or what I learned in it. Just a little bit more behind the scenes of a particular interview that you really enjoyed that day. We're going to release it again in this podcast feed, but with new insight from you.
All right. So just tell us briefly, I mean, I know you've been running through it all morning, but what is the best way for people, if they want early access, to get to it? They can go to like WJCT.org. They can sign up online.
Yes.
And I guess they can also call in, right?
Yes.
904-353-9528, because we're in the middle of a pledge drive.
We're in the middle of, yes, thank you for that. Yeah, so you can call that number, or you can go to WJCT.org/radio and you can sign up there. But if you call us, we'll help you sign up. I don't want you to be intimidated by like, okay, it's a podcast. How do I get it? We will walk you through the sign up process. And you can become, and that's just a part of it, right? Like the theme of this drive is now more than ever. And why it's urgent to support local independent journalism with your local public media station. So, we're giving this to you as a thank you gift, but really your donation keeps us all on the air doing what we love, and that's to serve you.
Well, thanks so much for being here. Kingpins and Catalysts goes live April 1st, but members get it first, so hope you listen. Letitia Variola, thanks so much for being here. All right, we'll be back in just 2 minutes.
Congaree & Penn, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpenn.com. Life South Community Blood Centers, providing blood and patient services to the local hospitals, serving patients in this community. Donating blood with Life South helps save lives. More at lifesouth.org to find a blood drive near you.
From media to tech to politics, the world around us is changing. Sometimes it's hard to know what you can rely on or trust. Your support means that NPR and this station will be here for you tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. We're not going anywhere. Show up for public media for Public Media Giving Days. Donate now and thank you.
Please call 353-9528 or visit us at wjct.org/radio.
On the next Fresh Air, Washington Post national education writer Laura Meckler joins us to discuss how the administration's calls to dismantle the Department of Education could reshape America's education landscape, impacting schools, colleges, and universities nationwide. Join us
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
What does your city do really well? Transportation, climate resilience? Maybe it's unique solutions for housing. Next time on 1A, we meet mayors who are facing their city's biggest challenges head on. What lessons do you think others can learn from your town or city's mayor? And what do you wish your mayor did differently? Email us at 1a@wamu.org.
Today starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, St. Patrick's Day is Monday, but if you have to work or you're just looking for a little pregame, then Mayport's got you covered. Here to tell us about what's on tap is David Murphy. He's the general manager of Mayport Brewing Company. Good morning, David.
Morning.
So tell me about this. This is the first ever St. Practice Day I've ever heard about. How did this come about?
So came up with this idea about a month ago. It's something we've been working on for a while. Mayport has an emerging bar and nightlife scene, and it would seem like a great way to bring exposure to it. Kind of bring people, show what Mayport has to offer. All the bar, we've got multiple bars: Gray Matter Distilleries, our sister bar Bedlam down the street, Voussoir, as well as Island Girl, a cigar bar as well.
Yeah.
And we all got together, figured that it's kind of more in our best interest all to work together, bring an experience to the Jacksonville community that, to display what each location has to offer.
And it's kind of a pub crawl, right? Is it the format? And
yes.
So people can go from one to the other. Are there things that connect them special-wise that people are offering?
So, yeah, we do offer, we offer specials. Each bar offers individual specials. Grey Matter, I believe, is doing like a shot special with their proprietary car vodka. At Bedlam and Mayport, we're doing a toast to St. Patrick at the top of the hour. So at Bedlam, it's going to be a green beer, round of green beers for the bar.
Maybe live up to its name.
Absolutely. And then we'll see. And then at Mayport, we're going to do a green tea toast, at the top of every hour. And then every other bar has their own specials and stuff like that. And it's really cool. It just adds value to the overall event.
Tell us a little bit about how Mayport is evolving and changing. It seems to have, in recent years, become a little bit more of obviously the naval base is there. That's been a defining characteristic. But it is different in its feel than other adjacent beach communities. What is its identity right now? How do you see it?
It's definitely on the up and up. And it's kind of, really a blank slate. It is an emerging community. And it's definitely something that we're looking to grow. It seems that because of the cost of living, the rising cost of living over at the beach, you do see a lot of younger couples and, moving towards there to, find more affordable housing, stuff like that. So you are seeing a community build. And, whenever there's something like that is being built, there's the need for a nightlife scene and, a social scene. And that's something that's evolving at that. And, Voussoir was probably the first bar on the Strip.
That's sort of a historic place, right? It's been there for
years.
Decades.
Yeah, decades. And then Bedlam was opened about a year ago. Mayport opened last April. It's developing more and more. And you're kind of seeing like it really does feel like, we're in the beginning stages of where, you saw these like Springfield and all these neighborhoods that have like established that kind of scene.
And taken off.
Yeah, taken off. And it's really cool. It's cool to be a part of that.
What is the brew pub, craft brew industry like right now? I know there have been a number of places that have closed and shuttered over the last year, but there's still a really strong kind of craft and brew community here in Jacksonville.
Yeah. Definitely very strong. And you've got Ruby Beach, Green Room, Rev just down the street. And it's definitely a very interesting community. I've been bartending in Jacksonville for the better part of 15 years. And,
wow.
There's a lot of people out there that are really serious about their beer. And there is changes in, to the brew pub industry, but that's also why it's important to diversify yourself with, craft cocktails, get in front of like rising trends like the CBD and THCA cocktail movements and, the no proof or low proof as well. So, it's all whenever you do manage a bar and stuff like that, you really do have to say, okay, what does the consumer want? Where are the gaps? And what are people drinking these days? And I think that's something really important to look at.
So it is called St. Practice Day. It is being jointly hosted by Bedlam, Grey Matter, Island Girl, Voussoir Lounge, and it's Saturday, right?
Yes, ma'am. This Saturday, 5 to 10.
5 to 10. All right. Well, it's nice to talk to you. Thanks for catching us up on Mayport and the scene out there. I hope you have a good St. Practice Day.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, David Murphy. And thank you for listening. That's our program. If you have feedback or suggestions, you can send either to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. If you missed anything today, you can catch our rebroadcast at 8 o'clock tonight, or you can find our entire archive at WJCT.org or your favorite podcast platform. The executive producer of First Coast Connect is David Luckin. Our show is produced by Stacey Bennett and directed by Brady Coram. Jamie Valet is our associate producer, and our theme music is performed by Club de Belugas. Join us tomorrow when we discuss the human cost of Doge cuts with locally impacted federal employees. I'm Anne Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. The Players' Championship returns to TPC Sawgrass March 11th through 16th. Watch the PGA Tour's top players and enjoy local bites at the Stadium Course in Ponte Vedra Beach. More info and tickets at theplayers.com.